Okay, Ivo, you can start.
Okay, it's a great pleasure for Fundación Libertad to host today Professor Steve Hanke, and he's a professor of applied economics at the University of Johns Hopkins. He's also a fellow director of the Troubled Currencies Project at the Cato Institute, and he's also a trader of Forex and commodities, and he's going to speak today about the impact of the pandemics in economics and liberty, right? So the plan is that Professor Hanke will speak around 15 minutes, and then we will open the chat for questions from the public. Welcome, Professor Hanke. You can go ahead, please.
Okay, it's great to be with you. I wish we were actually in Buenos Aires, but absent that, we'll do the Zoom. The title of my remarks today are, even in a pandemic, one should not lose sight of liberty. And of course, the Foundation Libertad has the right name. There's no question about that. And I must say, I've had a long association with the foundation. As I recall, I think in 1990 or perhaps early in 1991, the foundation published a book Kurt Schuler and I wrote. I think the first book we ever wrote on currency boards. Since then, we've written maybe 30 books on currency boards, but that was the first one. And related to that, the main point that I want to drive home today is that liberty is always based fundamentally on constitutions and rules of law associated and derived from constitutions. That's point number one. Now, as Hayek would say and emphasizes, which he's correct, is that there are a lot of custom laws and habits that are formed in societies that aren't in constitutions, but they are very important and they are very connected to liberty. But I will only be emphasizing the more formal rather than the informal kind of things that Hayek has talked about at great length. He's also, of course, emphasized constitutions. His Constitution of Liberty gets into that. When we come to Argentina, let me just make a couple of points, and this is related actually to that original currency board book that Schuler and I wrote. You, as you know, had a convertibility system, and the convertibility system unfortunately didn't follow the blueprint that Schuler and I laid out, and we said right after it was installed in April 1st, 1991, that eventually it would fail because there were many loopholes in the laws, and the law was in fact very flexible, and it allowed the central bank tremendous amount of discretion, which they used, and that's a no-no with a currency board. There is no discretion at all, zero, none. Anyway, it did last 10 years. It eventually blew up, as you all know, and now, just to give you an update, I use high-frequency data to measure inflation in Argentina. Today, it's 69.8%, the annual inflation. The official number is 42.8. So the official number is basically bogus, and it is not correct. My position on currencies in Argentina, I think the only way to solve the problem is to get rid of the peso, which in the last 3 years actually has lost 75.8% of its value against the US dollar. So the internal purchasing power of the pesos essentially disappeared, 3/4 of it anyway, in 3 years. So get rid of the peso, get rid of the central bank, mothball it, put them in museums, and start using what people in fact, freely used in Argentina. They like the dollar, and they like it, and they should be given the freedom to choose and use it as actually legal tender. At any rate, that's a little starting point. It's a little history of Argentina and things that interest me about Argentina. So I continue to monitor Argentina fairly closely related to inflation. Now, how about constitutions, laws, and liberty? If you look at countries with currency boards or countries that are dollarized, one argument that I've always used, and the most important part of dollarization or currency boards, is that they put a hard budget constraint in the system, and that means that the fiscal authorities have no monetary authority to go to obtain credit. That's the hard budget constraint. You cut the monetary authority, either the currency board, or if you're dollarized, you don't even have a monetary authority. You cut the fiscal authorities off from the money spigot. And so the hard budget constraint's very, very important. That's much more important than all the nonsense you read about monetary economics and so forth. It's a fiscal straitjacket and control mechanism. But if we look at what's going on in the world with dollarized countries and currency board countries, true, in general, the fiscal deficits are a lot less and the debt levels a lot lower in currency board countries than dollarized countries. But there are exceptions. And the exceptions end up being kind of interesting, because in 2000, we dollarized Ecuador. And what's happened to Ecuador? Ecuador is in default on its debt. It has so much debt. It's one of the 4 countries in the world that's actually in default, along, of course, with Argentina. You know, as I say, Argentina is probably the biggest deadbeat in the world. You know, they default one right after another in huge amounts. But Ecuador is dollarized and it's in default. So the hard budget constraint thing didn't really work there. Also, a country that's in big trouble with a lot of debt is Bosnia. And Bosnia in 1997 put in a currency board. They still have it. Montenegro is also in trouble. And I was the one who dollarized Montenegro in December of 1999. El Salvador is also in trouble. They're dollarized and they have a debt problem. So you've got 4 exceptions to the hard budget constraint that usually is imposed by currency boards or dollarization. So we come to the Constitution and liberty, and you have to have a fiscal rule that goes along with the monetary rule. In other words, the monetary rule would be a currency board or dollarization, and then you have a fiscal rule. Well, what is the fiscal rule? My fiscal rule that would solve this problem that has arisen in Ecuador, Bosnia, Montenegro, and El Salvador is as follows. You have a simple little equation, and the simple little equation is that outlays minus receipts equal a deficit. So you've got 3 variables. If you control 2 of those variables, you control the level of debt and the budget. So rule 1 on the fiscal rule would be that no total debt increase could occur in a country unless you had a supermajority vote. So that would be the constitutional rule. So you'd have to have 2/3 of the parliament agreeing for any allowance of an increase in the sovereign debt. The second rule, which would cover a second variable in that little equation would be that any tax increase would have to be approved by a supermajority vote. Now that would involve not only any increase in the rate of tax, obviously that would amount to a tax increase, or any increase in the base of a tax that's being imposed. Either one of those two, you would need supermajority voting. So in the monetary side, and if you actually want to enhance liberty, you have to start focusing on the Constitution, and this is one very good example. The Constitution should include some kind of fiscal rule. If you don't include a fiscal rule, even if you're dollarized or have a currency board, you potentially can have a problem. And Ecuador is a perfect case. Of course, we had President Correa, as you all know, was very, very left-wing and very opposed to dollarization. He never got rid of dollarization but dollarization is very popular. But he was complaining about it all the time, and he just went around using fiscal gimmicks and so forth to get Ecuador in a lot of trouble. So that is one aspect. The second aspect, let's get into the crisis now. We're in a pandemic. That's part of the title of my talk. And what happens after every pandemic or any kind of crisis, and Hayek spelled this out originally, and then Bob Higgs has done a lot of work on what's called the ratchet. And the ratchet is, if you have a crisis, the statists use the crisis to enlarge the state. And they do that in light of, or in the guise of, trying to solve whatever the crisis is. Now it's a pandemic. So we've locked down many economies, shut many factories, people are out of work, unemployment's very high, GDP's collapsing in almost every place in the world. And the government is opening the fiscal spigots to essentially subsidize and bail out many individuals and corporations. So that's what happens initially, but the ratchet is the following, and that is that this never goes away. I mean, you pass all kinds of laws, you put in new bureaus, new agencies, new programs, and once the crisis goes away, the agencies and bureaus and bureaucracy, they stay, and you've ratcheted up the intrusion of the state. You've taken the sphere of liberty is reduced. You ratchet up the state, that's the ratchet effect, and liberty and the private sector and economic and personal freedoms are restricted after the crisis. So I'm anticipating that we will have a huge shrinkage of liberty and freedom after the pandemic passes, because all these programs they're putting in will stay. Now, this in terms of implementing the ratchet, this crisis is unusual because, as you know, in Argentina, you usually have currency crises in Argentina. That's the big thing. And associated with that, you have banking crises. And with each one of those things, you get a ratchet going on. This is a different kind of a crisis. This is a public health crisis. And most of the people that are in charge now of calling the shots and dictating the rules of the game are people from public health and public health schools. Now, that is a big problem, because the public health schools, they have an ideology, and the ideology, they have a complete scorn for private enterprise, complete scorn for private enterprise, and a great deal of praise for any public enterprise. if you go to any public health school in the world, that's the ideology in simple terms. If you look at things like, for example, the National Health Service in Great Britain, which is a nationalized health operation that came into place right after World War II, it's praised to the heavens. It's the next thing to the Queen. The National Health Service, it's a religion in the United Kingdom. They can't do anything wrong. It turns out that the record during this pandemic of the United Kingdom is terrible. They've done an absolutely terrible job. But if you listen to the BBC News every night or read the British press, I can tell you, you will not see anything but praise of the National Health Service. Also, another country, not institution that's praised during the pandemic is Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is a communist country. It's a darling, again, like the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. Vietnam is a darling of the public health crowd and the epidemiologists and so forth. So why is that? Well, for one thing, they've actually recorded 0 deaths in Vietnam. I'm quite skeptical about that number, and the medical people I talk to are skeptical about it too. But officially, the number is 0 deaths in Vietnam. This is kind of strange because they've done studies that some epidemiologists from Australia have done studies, and one thing that they eat, a delicacy that's served in restaurants in Vietnam and widely included on menus are something called forest rats. And they tested these, and 55% of all these forest rats actually are carrying the COVID virus. So that's one reason I'm skeptical about. They have 0 deaths, and they're eating a lot of wild animals that actually are carrying the COVID virus. Now, another thing, back to the schools of public health and the darling of those public health officials being Vietnam. If you look at the countries that restrict domestic movement, freedom of domestic movement the most in the world, Vietnam has a 0 ranking. It has almost complete control. Another one is Venezuela. That's the only country with a 0 rating in Latin America is Venezuela. But other countries on the list that you'll see, you've got Iran, you've got Russia, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Thailand, Ukraine, Venezuela, Vietnam, Yemen, Zambia. There are very few. Even China gets a rating of 5. China, the communist China even has more freedom of internal movement. This is controlling internal movement than someplace like Vietnam. So Vietnam happens to be praised. Now, who's trashed? What country is trashed the most when you read the press on the pandemic? Well, it's Sweden. Sweden has a very laissez-faire approach to the pandemic. They've had very few restrictions on anything, including movement and including lockdowns. Now, a couple months ago, Lars Joning, a Swedish colleague of mine, we wrote an article about this that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, so you can read that. But the nub of this problem, or why is Sweden unique? Why? That's the question. Why is Sweden unique? Why are there no lockdowns? Why do they want to keep the economy going, etc.? It turns out it's back to the constitutions. The constitution that was formed in the 17th century in Sweden prohibits any interference by the government in internal or external movement of Swedes, unless it's in a time of war. That's the only exception. Or there can be conscription, for example, and restrictions in movement. So it would be unconstitutional for Sweden to lock down and restrict Swedes' movement in this pandemic. It's the only country in the world that has a constitutional right to liberty and freedom of movement. So that's why it's unique, and that's why it is a big target in the international press of all the public health people around on Sweden. You can't pick up anything about Sweden without a negative spin on the story. Another aspect of the Swedish policy, that the Constitution is one in regard to freedom of movement, but also this is related to liberty too. In the Constitution, agencies and bureaus in the Swedish system cannot be manned by people that have political appointments. So the politicians can't fool around with it. The health agency in Sweden, the head of that agency is not a political appointment. And the politicians can't put their fingers on the agency and fool around with it. So as a result of that, these agencies have a lot of respect and trust in the Swedish population. The level of trust in public authorities is one of the highest in the world in Sweden. And that is because of a constitutional provision that prohibits politicians from getting their fingers in these agencies and fooling around with them. Now, let me just give you a few things. I actually tweeted on this, and that is that the recent results, we're talking about the number of corona cases per million, and you get very high numbers in Brazil, the US, South Africa, Colombia, even Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. Sweden has some of the lowest numbers available, but you're not going to find those in the press. They are available. They're all public. Johns Hopkins University tallies all of these things. But when they write negative stories about Sweden, they fail to tell us that the number of cases and the number of deaths per capita are in fact very low in Sweden. They're not the lowest in the world, but they're very low. And Sweden's economy, by the way, is still registering positive growth. GDP is actually still positive in Sweden. It's one of the few countries that's actually still positive. So the economy is relatively open. It's taken a big hit, and the health situation is pretty good, and liberty is, up, and it's right up on top because of the Constitution. So I think with those kind of introductory remarks, I would suggest from the floor, Gerardo, to questions, or whoever is handling the questions and answers.
Professor Hanke, I have a question. You are a very strong advocate, clearly, of dollarization as an alternative monetary system for countries who are unable to manage monetary policy properly. But what's your view of the dollar, the future of the dollar as a global currency in the context of the pandemic, given the expansion of monetary supply in the US and the aggressive fiscal policies which are a threat of fiscal dominance for the future of the Federal Reserve?
That's a very good question, and one that's hard to anticipate. All I would say is that the dollar totally dominates everything right now. Absolutely everything. People do not realize that the dollar is not only the international reserve currency, but it is the currency, for example, that is used in all these companies in Asia, the beginning, all supply chains for final goods and services that show up in the West, in the United States, in Europe, to a large extent in South America. They all have a piece of the supply chain that actually starts in Asia. And all those Asian companies, they're doing business in dollars. They're invoicing in dollars, they're pricing in dollars. And that's why, by the way, 3 months ago, John Greenwood and I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal in which we said the big thing that the Fed has to do is arrange for swap arrangements with the central banks in Asia, because, why? Because the supply chains all start there. All the businesses are doing all their business in dollars, and they need dollar credit lines. But the Asian central banks, they have a lot of dollar reserves, but not that much. So they have to be in a position, for example, in Japan, just as one example, to swap Japanese yen to the Fed in exchange for US dollars, so that the Japanese central bank has enough dollars to extend credit to the Japanese banking system, which will then be extending lines of credit and so forth to Japanese and other businesses. So the Fed did that, by the way. That is one big aspect of what they've done since February. The Fed's balance sheet is increased by 68% since February. And the money supply itself is M2, measuring an M2. That isn't the broadest measure, but that's the broadest one the Fed measures. That's increased by about 38% year over year. So since February. The year over year broad money measure is going up now at about 32% in the United States, totally unprecedented. So your point is, well, what if this continues? If this continues, you know, we're going to start looking like Argentina. And that would undermine the dollar. So that's one thing it's possible. I don't think it's going to happen, because I think once inflation gets up to about 4 or 4.5%, the Fed will panic and start tightening very fast in the United States. Then we will see negative interest rates disappear, because right now we have negative real interest rates in the United States. That's why the stock market's booming so much. That we have negative real interest rates, so the stock market's going to keep going up. There might be big shocks coming in, bad news from China, U.S.-China relations, or something like that, and the market could lose 20 or 25% of its value in a week. But it will still keep going up because of negative interest rates. So bonds are very unattractive. Gold is actually more attractive than bonds right now. And stocks are very attractive in a negative real interest rate environment.
How long can it take until we have inflation moving up to 4% like you outlined?
What?
How long may it take until inflation moves up to 4% or so?
I think within the next year and a half.
Okay.
This would depend on a number of things, but just roughly. When it gets into forecasting inflation, I normally do not forecast inflation. And I measure it very accurately. Like the number I gave you for Argentina is very accurate. And the number I give for Lebanon or Venezuela, all those numbers are very, very accurate. I'm using high frequency data, purchasing power parity theory. I have no problem in doing that. Forecasting inflation is, especially in high inflation countries, almost an impossible task. But let me get back to your question, because I'm kind of wandering around here. So one thing, I think the Fed has done what needed to be done. They needed to inject a massive amount of liquidity, put in the currency swaps, and stabilize the financial markets so we didn't have a financial crisis on top of the GDP kind of crisis that we're in. Most of the assets that they purchased, about 65% of all that increase in the balance sheet, the asset side of the balance sheet of the Fed, is in what's called Treasury Bills. Now, those are very short term in duration, 2 years or less, are Treasury Bills. So it's conceivable that they would just let these things run off, and all this expansion would automatically disappear within less than 2 years, you see. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I told you, I do think that they will tighten if inflation gets up to about 4%, which, by the way, the Fed is not forecasting 4%. They do not think inflation is going to go up. I think it will, but they don't think it's going to. The second thing going on with the dollar, and more problematic, and this gets more into your question, really, I think the dollar will, the U.S. monetary policy will remain, shall we say, in a zone of sanity. We're not going to see some insane kind of monetary policy. I don't anticipate anything like that. But the problem with the dollar, all these sanctions that are being put on various countries, since the Twin Towers, 9/11, all the presidents, George W. Bush, President Obama, and now Trump in particular, they use financial sanctions to go after anyone they don't like. Now, this is a problem because the financial sanctions are in fact going after property rights in the US dollar. They're restricting people from using the US dollar. Now, for these small places like North Korea and Iran and Venezuela, places like that, those aren't very important. But they actually were talking about, this didn't happen, but 3 weeks ago, it looked like it might happen. I was involved in recommending that they not do it, and I won the argument at the White House. And the argument was that they wanted to put financial sanctions on Hong Kong's currency board and banking system to cut them off from access to US dollars. Now, the Hong Kong currency board, it emits a Hong Kong dollar. The Hong Kong dollar is backed 100% with US dollar reserves. So the Hong Kong dollar is a clone of the US dollar. And the US was thinking about taking the property rights away from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority so they couldn't access their dollars and use their dollars. Now this sanction thing is a long-run, real potential threat against the dollar as the international currency. That is the real threat, not so much the monetary policy kinds of things. The dollar, by the way, has become weaker since the virus started, but that's mainly because of negative interest rates, negative real interest rates. So the dollar's gotten a little weaker, not too much, but a little weaker. And it probably will continue to be weak until real interest rates turn positive. Anyway, that's too long an answer for your question, but I think that right now, as far as the eye can see, the dollar will remain king. It is not going to be taken away as a reserve currency, as the international currency. It dominates much more than you think. Even in Great Britain, let me give you an example. Even in Great Britain, you've got the pound sterling. And what's the currency that Germany uses? They use the euro. So you'd think that manufactured goods in trade between Germany and Great Britain would either be priced in sterling or euros. No, 35% is priced in dollars. So the dollar is just absolutely every place. And these other currencies, even the euro, which is the biggest regional currency, is small potatoes, really. It just, in the international scene, the euro just doesn't count, and it's number 2.
Professor Hanke, you mentioned China as a potential threat for the stock market. Do you foresee the possibility of a real military problem between the US and China?
Yes. It could be accidental. I mean, you could have an aircraft carrier from the US and a destroyer from China having an accident and a collision in the South China Sea. Now that would really escalate things. I don't see a hot war as in troops invading Chinese territory or something like that. But tensions will increase. They will not decrease.
Speaking about Argentina now, these days in the US, there is a very popular monetary theory called the modern monetary theory, which looks like Argentine monetary policy. Why do you think this theory is so popular, and why the proponents of this theory don't see the failures of this proposal in other countries?
Well, number one, I don't think they want to see the failures of the theory, and the theory is really just a shroud covering political agendas in which they want to behave like the Argentine fiscal authorities. They want to spend more money, and they don't want any kind of constraints. Back to my earlier comment, they want to take any hard budget constraint out of the system. They want to remove it from the system. So you can have a lot more spending and the ratchet. These things all come back to what I was talking about, and kind of, I mean, to me, they're organized, but maybe not to you because you haven't heard me talk about them before. But they all connect, and the modern monetary theory is very important. It's very important because it's become popular because politicians have jumped on the bandwagon. And let me give you an example of how kind of misguided it is. They use Japan as an example of modern monetary theory and how it works. And they say, look, Japan, the debt level, the fiscal debt relative to GDP, it's something like 240% of GDP or it's a very big number. It's the biggest one in the world, I think, Japan. But there's no inflation. They've essentially had deflation for 10 years, but they have a huge fiscal deficit, a mountain of massive debt. And the modern monetary theorists say, yeah, see, that proves that we're right. You can have huge deficits, huge debt and everything, and no inflation. And the point that they miss is the following. You have a huge fiscal deficit each year in Japan, but you have massive private savings. They ignore the private sector and private sector savings. So in aggregate, they actually have positive savings in Japan. You actually have capital outflows going out of Japan because of, in aggregate, once you get the private sector in, there is no deficit. There's actually a surplus. So they don't even look at the numbers. They cherry pick the numbers and come up with all kinds of bogus justifications for what they're doing. But modern monetary theory is very, very much in vogue. It's very much in fashion right now in certain quarters of the United States. And I like the Argentine example.
Taking advantage of your experience on commodities and foreign exchange, and given that Argentina is a very important player in the agriculture commodity world, how do you see the impact of the US monetary policy in commodities in general, and more particular in agriculture commodities?
It's positive because let's keep this one short and simple. If the dollar keeps getting a little weaker, it helps the commodities. These are all priced in dollars. So if the dollar gets weaker, automatically the nominal price of the commodity has to go up, and it does go up. So I think it's a positive for agricultural commodities.
Another question. Sometimes you make proposals about dollarization, and sometimes you make proposals about currency boards. Which are the pros and cons of each of these alternatives?
Well, they're technically both really the same thing, because a currency board produces a domestic currency, but that currency, if it's an orthodox currency board, I'm not talking about convertibility now. Convertibility was not a currency board. But if you have a real currency board, the local domestic currency is a clone of whatever the anchor is. So if the dollar is the anchor currency, the local currency is a clone of the dollar. It's the same thing. The Hong Kong dollar is exactly the same as the US dollar, but it has two advantages. One is a symbolic. You have a national currency, you're not dependent on a foreign currency in that sense. You have notes and coins that circulate with some local politician's picture on the or hero on the bills. But the main thing is you earn seigniorage. Dollarization, unless you have some private arrangement or some international treaty with the Federal Reserve or U.S. Treasury, dollarization does carry a cost, an opportunity cost, because you don't earn any seigniorage on it, the dollarized country. Like Panama earns no seigniorage on having the dollar as its official currency. So Ecuador, El Salvador, same thing. But with a currency board, you do earn seigniorage because you're emitting a liability, the domestic money that pays no interest. And you're required to have 100% reserves backing that domestic currency, and those reserves are invested and they're earning interest.
Would you say that if Argentina dollarized, they should also adopt the US banking system with deposits and loans under US law?
No, I don't think that's necessary at all. I don't think it's necessary, and it might actually. I haven't thought this through carefully. In the case of Argentina, it might be a bad idea actually, because my view is that it would just rile up the populace in Argentina and be another excuse to have them go hate the gringos and all of that kind of thing. I think it's better to let the banks let them be regulated by Argentine authorities. I've thought about this in the context of currency boards in Bulgaria, for example. I designed and put in the currency board in 1997 in Bulgaria. It works very well, and they did have a banking crisis in 2017. And it was because the currency board, the way it's organized, it was a little like convertibility. The issue department at the Bulgarian National Bank is the currency board and operates with the currency board law. The banking department is the one that regulates the Bulgarian banking system. And basically they made mistakes. They let a perfectly blatantly fraudulent bank operate and so forth without shutting it down. But even in that case, I've argued that the Bulgarians should fix their own problems. They should regulate their own banks. They should not have they shouldn't have the European Central Bank in Frankfurt be involved in regulating their banks. That's not what they've done. But my recommendation was the Bulgarians should keep the regulation of banks to themselves.
I have a question here from Susana Cohen-Arasi that I'm going to read. She says the following: never was healthy people put in jail all over the planet, except free countries like Uruguay, Sweden, Taiwan. Then don't you think China, with the World Health Organization, is trying to develop power, even military power, cultural power, with movements, molecular wars in many countries like Black Lives Matter, gender, coming from socialism, 21st century? We should not obey and use our personal liberty then? Well,
in general, I agree with that observation. This is I think a much more perhaps fundamental problem than even I alluded to. I mean, you have to have a provision in the Constitution, like Sweden, that it is illegal in Sweden to lock people down. You can't do it. So, and I agree that if you, in other words, what was her name? Susanna?
Yes.
Susanna. So Susanna, I think it has summarized essentially everything that I had to say in one statement. Her statement is fundamentally correct, broadly speaking, and the enemy are these countries like China. Is, I mentioned Vietnam. It's a communist country. It's small potatoes. They have 92 or 93 million people, and it has not that much influence. But China is big. You can't ignore China, and this idea of restricting freedom of movement, it is coming from those communist countries. I mean, I went down the list of countries in my talk, and you have them one by one restricting all kinds of freedoms. So I think Susanna's point is the most important one. But let me read this. This is relative to what Susanna was saying. This is a letter to the Financial Times from Stephen Hazel, H-A-Z-E-L-L. He's Hazel Smith. It's a hyphenated. Stephen Hazel Smith. June 18th, 2020, in the Financial Times. He said. He's criticizing the editorial in the Financial Times. The editorial in the Financial Times was titled "A Very Sort of Swedish Failure." And the letter reads, "But unlike here in the UK, Sweden hasn't delayed thousands of life-saving cancer operations, made the population fearful of going to the doctor, caused immense and incalculable damage to people's mental health, stymied pupils' education, finished off a large part of the hospitality industry, turned high streets into ghost towns, and sent the government into a paralysis of contradictory edicts. If Sweden is a failure, then surely the UK and many other Western countries have produced a COVID-19 catastrophe." So that's exactly, he's saying what Susanna was saying. See, there's an opportunity cost of locking everybody down too, which he's getting at. The opportunity cost is people aren't free to go to the hospital if I have a cancer operation that needs to be taken care of, some cancer problem, I can't go to the hospital because they're saving all the hospital space for COVID people, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all taking away freedoms and causing all kinds of problems. I don't hear you.
Okay. Why do you think that in principle, people who are more center-right, they are more against quarantines, and people who are more on the left, they are very pro-quarantines? What's the reason of that split?
The only, well, in fact, people on the left say more or less are more comfortable with government edicts, government regulations, government intrusions, and so forth, than at least some of the people on the center. Some of the people on the right are very comfortable also with all kinds of government regulations and edicts. Our problem is that you have very few people who actually are classical liberals, let's say, and think about liberty. There are very few people, whether the right or the left, both don't think about liberty and the benefits of having liberty, the importance of having liberty, and that should be really almost the #1 priority should be liberty. And this gets back in a practical way, by the way. A lot of people on the left are influenced by the public health schools. And I know the public health schools, I gave you the ideology. Praise the public sector and you know, go round or go negative on anything in the private sector. So
we are approaching our hour, and I would like to make a final question, and it's about Argentina. So you know Argentina is finalizing the negotiation of the foreign debt. Then it has a pending discussion with the IMF. Today is going through quarantines in several parts of the country, and it has quite anti-private sector economic policies. So what's the outlook for Argentina of this kind of cocktail, in your opinion?
I'm pretty negative. I mean, even though I love, as you know, I love Argentina as a place, but I can see even little things like they're ramping up this you know, as we call it, even in the United States, the Falklands thing again is warming up. So it's just, I don't see anything positive about Argentina, honestly.
I have a final question. How do you see is going to be the future of liberty in Argentina, in Latin America in general, if the US is somehow stepping back from their traditional role in the continent and leaving China and other countries developing a stronger presence in the continent without them around?
I think in general, not just Latin America. Latin America has a fatal attraction to the statism, interventionism, populism, all kinds of anti-liberty things. I mean, I would say Latin America has an attraction, a fatal attraction to anti-liberty ideas. That is the problem. But it's not just Latin America, because I think after the pandemic, I see a very dark future every place, not just Latin America, because of this ratchet. And we've never had. It's one thing to have an economic crisis, a banking crisis, a currency crisis. It's another thing to have a pandemic where you have everyone in control really is out of these public health schools. And so you get the public health school kind of ideology coming in. We need more government control. We need, back to Susanna's point, she had a long list of things, and every one of those things is viewed as being good by the public health people. They say all those things are good. All those anti-liberty things are, from their point of view, they're good, and they keep us safe and they keep us healthy. But when you think about health, by the way, the public health crowd, what would they would have? They would be dictating our diet. They would be dictating how many hours we were allowed to sleep every night, and on and on and on. It's a micromanagement of the human to get the human in a mold that satisfies the mold of the public health officials.
But do you think there is any room for a movement like civil disobedience or sort of a Gandhi approach against these policies?
Yes, I do, but we have to articulate our message much more clearly. Even in a simple thing in Argentina, for example, you know what my point of view is. I'm measuring inflation every day, and even on that inflation measure, I as far as I know, I don't have any voice in Argentina. Now, if I had a voice in Argentina and could debate what the proper inflation number is, that looks like a very tiny, narrow thing. But that would be a situation where I had a voice, and I could talk. I would be talking about other things. So we don't really have much of a voice. We talk to each other, which is fine. I enjoy doing this. That's what we're doing right now. But outside, it's difficult. Even though I have discovered from my young assistants that something called Twitter is very effective. I've got like 266,000 followers now, and Focus Economics ranks me as the fourth most influential economist in the world right now. And it's because I do have a voice, because I have a Twitter, and I've got a big following and important following. But that takes a lot of work, and it's quite enjoyable. I enjoy it and so forth. But sometimes you feel like it's a voice in the wilderness, if you know what I mean.
Okay. We arrived to the hour that we scheduled originally, and I don't know if you want to leave any other message, Professor Hanke, before we.
Well, I think the key thing is for us, we have to continue to talk to each other, but we have to get our voice in the public. It's public opinion that drives these things, that drives these government policies. If public opinion was against all the stupidities the government was doing in Argentina, the government wouldn't be doing all the stupidities. Even if you're a dictator, you have to obey public opinion. You cannot sustain even dictatorial powers and authoritarian rules without the support of the public opinion. So it's the public opinion that we have to change. And that means that we really have to be out there engaging in the public, not just among ourselves. That's fine. We have to become, to use the word, we have to become evangelicals for liberty.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Hanke, for your participation. Thank you very much for all the assistants who were here today with us. And that's it. And
thank you. It's great to be with you. And Have a great weekend in Argentina. Wish I was there.
Bye-bye. Thank you
Bye.
very much.